In today's video, we are going to be feeding some South American cichlids. We did a video recently on feeding African cichlids that you all seem to like, and a few of you commented that you would like to see the same video on South American cichlids. So that's what we're going to do today specifically. Can't wait to get to this one, so let's dive right in. So you may know that I have 10 cichlid tanks down here in my basement, and a majority of those are South American cichlids. We have my 180-gallon aquarium here with a big Oscar, big Severums, and just other big adult South American cichlids. Then we have the 150-gallon with some slightly smaller cichlids, including some Geophagus, some electric blue acara, and even some angelfish that have some slightly smaller mouths and just overall shape. And then we have my 90-gallon discus tank here, and discus can be a bit finicky when it comes to feeding, so we're going to go through a few nuances there. And then in my fish room I have a couple other cichlid tanks, including some young electric blue acara and some small apistogramma, and then some cold water cichlids as well that we'll talk through, which also have their own nuances. So when it comes to the South Americans, we are going to see a wide variety and range of cichlids today. I'm going to talk about the food I give them, what type, what brand, and especially the quantity. I'm going to show specific quantities I give each of my fish, and just throughout the video there are going to probably be a handful of tips that I would suggest when keeping South American cichlids. One of the most important aspects when it comes to feeding is just to know the types of cichlids that you have. Some South American cichlids might prefer a heavier protein-based diet versus a more veggie-based diet. In this tank I have a big Oscar, I have Severums, Walrus, Geophagus, and all of these have slightly different dietary requirements. Something like the Oscar would really like some bigger pellets, bigger flakes that are high in protein, whereas Severums and Walrus are omnivores and would prefer a little more veggie-based foods in their diet. Another thing I keep in mind with this tank is the size of the fish. The big Tiger Oscar will get some of those monster pellets, but then I'll mix in slightly smaller 3mm pellets, the big fella from Extreme, and a lot of the other fish in this tank will get those slow sinking pellets. And then I'll also give this tank krill flakes and occasionally spirulina flakes from Extreme. These are really large flakes that could easily be crushed up for smaller fish, but the Oscar will readily take these flakes as well. And once some of those flakes scatter into the aquarium, some of the smaller to mid-sized fish will definitely clean up the rest of those. As I mentioned, Severums and Walrus prefer a little bit of vegetable matter in their diet, so that's where the spirulina flakes come in. I actually mixed it in with some of the krill here, and I like to give this tank just a little bit more of that than some of my other fish. And one other thing I keep in mind with this tank specifically is that some of these cichlids are nearing their adult sizes or close to it, so they don't need feedings quite as frequently as maybe smaller or juvenile fish. So if you have adult cichlids, you may only need to feed once per day. That's what I do. And I'll usually go about 6 days per week, so I'll give them 1 day off of feeding so that they can kind of clear everything out of their system. And then in my 150 here, some of these South American cichlids are a bit smaller than in the 180, so I do reduce the size of pellets and flakes that I sometimes give these guys. It's kind of a common sense thing, but if you have cichlids with smaller mouths like the angelfish, you probably want a smaller pellet or flake so that they can eat that pretty easily, and some of that bigger food won't go uneaten in the tank. I also like slow sinking pellets because there are Geophagus in this tank, and they love sifting through the sand looking for that uneaten food. And I find with most South American cichlids, they will eat food off of the substrate. Maybe some of your angels or discus will do that a little bit less, but in general, if you have slow sinking pellets, they should be just fine. And they should eat all the pellets you give them as long as you aren't overfeeding. And that's another big tip I would like to talk about, is just not overfeeding your aquarium. A lot of people want their fish to just grow quick and color up, but if you throw too much food in the aquarium, it kind of does the opposite effect. It kind of reduces your water parameters, increases the nitrates in the aquarium, and really it's the water quality and water parameters of your tank that will increase the growth rate of your fish much more than the food that you give them. And in this tank I also feed it just once per day, 6 days per week, and I try and keep that quantity in check. I don't want to be overfeeding the tank and increasing the nitrates, which will bring harm to the fish long term, versus trying to feed them too much on a daily basis. And just another quick tip, when feeding South American cichlids, I do believe a variety is key for these guys. They will really enjoy a mix of different brands and type of foods. Again, I really look for high protein based diets for most of these cichlids, but even some of those guys could use a little bit of veggie matter, and some of the fish that prefer veggie matter like severums and wateroo could definitely have some protein and do just fine. But I do like to mix in a little bit of differences with some of the dry goods that I use. Most of the time it's Extreme, but I also use other brands like Aquarium Co-op or Sarah, and just kind of mix in a few things occasionally so that they're not always eating the same food every day. And when it comes to frozen foods, every brand that I've seen out there has been just fine. I'll usually give brine shrimp and bloodworms to most of my aquariums about once every 2 weeks as kind of a treat so that they're not stuck on that frozen food. Because if you only feed frozen food regularly, sometimes they won't eat the dry food. So I try to keep a nice balance there. Frozen food is a great option. I would just limit it to maybe once every week or two. And when it comes to discus, they can sometimes be the most finicky of South American cichlids when it comes to food. And to kind of get around that, I provide a wider variety of foods for them. I'll primarily give them the krill and spirulina flake from Extreme, but I'll also give them some small pellets from Extreme, like the nano pellet even, or the peewee pellet, because they do have smaller mouths. Sometimes that's easier for them to eat. And also specific to this tank, I sometimes mix in beef heart flakes, which the discus really seem to like. It's not always the main ingredient I go for, but it is something that kind of rounds out their diet. And then sometimes I add in freeze-dried foods. So the Tubifex worms here, it's kind of fun to stick that square on the front panel, see the tetras and the discus go crazy for it. And you could also use this time to kind of monitor your fish, get a close-up look at them as they come to the front panel, and just make sure everyone's happy and healthy. And I'll put links in the description to all the foods that I mentioned today that I use the most often. But if your fish are eating the food that you're currently giving them and the ingredients are solid, I would just stick with that, and more so just hone in on the amount of food that you're giving them to make sure you're not overfeeding the tank. And then one other big tip I would provide when feeding your fish is just to consider the ingredients, which will always be on the label. The first couple ingredients will always be the highest percent of the food makeup. So if it's something like krill meal, shrimp meal, squid meal, something like that, it's all heavy protein based foods. It's way less processed foods like rice flour or wheat meal or fish meal. Some of the lesser quality foods that I've seen out there, the top ingredient will be some of those less desirable things, and usually that will mean less healthy fish, and sometimes the fish just will spit out the food and won't enjoy it as much. And that's one of the main reasons I usually stick with Extreme when it comes to dry foods, because most of the top ingredients are the quality ones you're after, and none of that processed food that is less desirable. And we're actually going to skip the African cichlid tank here. If you'd like to see a video on feeding African cichlids, check out this video here. And then heading into the fish room, there are 3 other cichlid tanks I'll talk about, starting with the 40-gallon breeder. This has Gymnogeophagus terrapurpura, which are cold water cichlids, and they're similar to the Geophagus, my other tanks, but they are smaller, so I tend to lean towards sinking pellets that are more like 1 millimeter or smaller, so the peewee pellets or the nano pellets. Also, I'll crush up the flakes from Extreme, since I mentioned they are pretty big flakes. If you just crush them up a little bit, all of the food, including the tetras and the panda cories, they can all get food and they're all happy and healthy. And this is the typical amount that I will give them. And even though they are on the smaller end and sometimes smaller fish need more frequent feedings, they are about 2 years old now, so they're kind of reaching their adult size. I don't feel like I need to feed them more than once per day, so they're currently on that schedule. But then if you move over to my 75-gallon tank, these electric blue acara that I've been growing out for about a year, they've had a diet that's slightly different than the rest of the tanks. Again, the foods are very protein based, like krill flake and some of the pellets that are slow sinking. When they were really young fry, I was giving them the nano pellets from Extreme, and then I was crushing up flakes as finely as I could so that it kind of went all over the tank, and the fry would find it eventually, and they really grew up quick on that. Once they were about 5 or 6 months old, I crushed up the flakes a little bit less and just used common sense when giving them flakes and foods. If the pellets were too big and they weren't getting eaten, go for a pellet size that's a little bit smaller. And now that these guys are about a year old, I give them the 1 millimeter pellets They sometimes could eat the big fella pellets, they're 3 millimeters, but usually the peaweed pellets will do just fine, and they go crazy for that and they eat it very quickly. I'll mix that in with some flakes. The main difference in this tank is that I will feed them twice per day. Probably in a few months when they get a little bit more size, I will start dialing it back to once per day and 6 days per week. And then down below that tank is my quarantine tank that's holding a pistogramma, which is a dwarf cichlid. And when it comes to some of the dwarf cichlids, I feel like the crushed up flakes and the nano pellets do really well. Once the pistos become adult size, so maybe double what this pair is right now, they can sometimes eat the peaweed pellets, but I might just stick with the nano pellets with these guys for a long time because they do eat it very readily, and if they're not making a mess and eating all the pellets, then it's usually working really well. So as you can see, when it comes to feeding South American cichlids, even when you have a variety of types, sizes, and shapes, it really is not too complicated. Just find a couple foods that work well for you. I would suggest high protein based foods unless you have a few of the specific fish that require veggie based diets. And also just make sure you're not overfeeding your food. Provide a variety of options sometimes, especially with some of your picky eaters like discus, and just getting on a feeding schedule that works for you, that you can consistently give them, and use a bit of common sense when it comes to the size and shape of the fish you're giving, and you should have no issues. But if you do have any questions about feeding South American cichlids or specific types, make sure to leave that down in the comment section. We're always happy to help. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.